I walked into the bank to ask for a $500 loan, and the manager said no. 90 seconds later, a stranger leaned toward the counter and said 4 words that changed my life. "Check her other account." The banker's face went white. "Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Rachel Doyle, and for a long time I believed that if you built something honest with your own 2 hands, nobody could ever take it away from you. I was wrong about that, but I didn't learn how wrong until I was 44 years old, sitting in a beige plastic chair at Cascade Trust Bank on Marymount Avenue in Asheville, North Carolina, being told that my credit did not qualify me for a $500 personal loan. To understand how I got to that chair, you have to go back 11 years, to a rented storage unit behind a fabric warehouse where I kept 3 bolts of upholstery linen, a second-hand sewing machine, and a business card I had printed myself at a copy shop that read Doyle and Rowe Design Studio. Rowe was Nicole Ashford's maiden name. We had met in a design elective in community college when we were both 22, both broke, both convinced that if we just worked hard enough, taste and effort would eventually be enough. For a long time we started small, reupholstering thrift store chairs and selling them out of Nicole's garage on weekends. Within 4 years, we had a leased storefront on Haywood Road and 3 employees. By the time I turned 39, Doyle and Rowe had grown into a full interior design and renovation firm with 14 people on payroll, a warehouse full of inventory, and a client list that included some of the nicest homes in Buncombe County. Nicole and I were 50-50 partners, on paper and in every conversation we ever had about the future. I trusted her the way you trust a sister. I had no siblings of my own, and for 17 years, Nicole had been the closest thing to one. The first crack appeared on a Thursday afternoon in late winter, 10 months before the day I sat in that plastic chair. I was going over our quarterly numbers, something I always handled myself, though Nicole's husband, Grant Ashford, had recently begun helping with what she called the boring legal side of things. Grant was a real estate attorney with a corner office downtown, and a laugh that arrived exactly 1/2 second after everyone else's, as if he were calculating whether it was worth the effort. He had offered to restructure the company to reduce our tax exposure, and Nicole had presented it to me like a gift she was handing me personally. "He's saving us thousands, Ratch. You don't have to think about any of it." I was distracted that season. My younger brother, Danny, had been in a car accident on I-40 and was recovering slowly at a rehabilitation facility 2 hours away in Hickory, and I was driving down every weekend to sit with him, to argue with his insurance company, to hold his hand through physical therapy sessions that left him gray and shaking. I signed whatever Grant put in front of me without reading every clause the way I should have. I told myself Nicole would never let anything happen to me. I told myself that trust was the same thing as safety. It is not. Going through the winter ledgers, I found an invoice for $3,850 paid to a vendor called Ridgeline Supply Partners. I didn't recognize the name. We had never ordered from a company by that title in 11 years of business. When I mentioned it to Nicole over the phone, she laughed it off easily, the same warm laugh I had known since we were 22. "Oh, that's one of Grant's contacts. Better pricing on hardware and fixtures. He's looking out for us." I let it go, though I wrote the name down on a sticky note and pressed it into the corner of my desk calendar. Over the following month I found 2 more unfamiliar vendors, smaller amounts, $600 here, $900 there, and then a larger one, $14,200 paid to a company called Blue Harbor Consulting. When I searched for it online, there was nothing. No website, no address. No trace of it anywhere except our own outgoing payments. I asked Nicole again, and this time her voice had a different texture, flatter, more instructive and warm. "Rachel, Grant handles the vendor side now. You need to let him do his job. It was the first time in 17 years she had told me what to do instead of asking what I thought. I should have pushed harder in that moment. I didn't. I was still driving to Hickory every weekend, and by early spring, Danny had passed away from complications no one had predicted, and grief closed over the next 2 months of my life like water over a stone. By June, my personal checking account, the one my modest salary draw from the business fed into, had gone dangerously thin. I had been so consumed with my brother's funeral and the paperwork that follows a death that I had barely glanced at my own finances in weeks. When I finally sat down at my kitchen table and opened my banking app, the room actually seemed to tilt sideways. There were 4 delinquent accounts under my name that I had no memory of opening. A store credit card carrying a $6,400 balance. A business equipment loan for $19,000. A personal line of credit for $11,500 from a lender I had never heard of. Altogether, I was more than $36,000 in debt that I had never authorized. My credit score, which had sat comfortably above 760 the previous year, had collapsed to 502. That is why, on a gray Tuesday morning in September, I found myself in a plastic chair inside Cascade Trust Bank, filling out an application for a $500 loan to cover an overdue power bill. $500, an amount I had once spent without a second thought on a single set of drapery hardware for a client's dining room. The loan officer, a young man named Preston who could not have been older than 26, looked at his monitor and then at me with the careful blankness of someone trained to deliver disappointing news gently. "I'm very sorry, Miss Doyle. Based on your current credit profile, we're not able to approve this application today." I thanked him. I don't know why people thank the person delivering their bad news, but I did. I gathered my bag and walked toward the glass doors, and that is where the second half of this story truly begins, the part the title of this video already promised you. A man's voice stopped me before I reached the exit. "Excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you Rachel Doyle? From Silver Creek Lake?" I turned around. He was maybe 50, lean, silver threading through dark hair at his temples, dressed in a gray jacket that looked expensive without trying to announce itself. His expression was not quite recognition and not quite urgency, but something layered between the two. Silver Creek Lake. 6 years earlier. A Sunday afternoon in July, the water shockingly cold for the season, a man 40 feet from the dock going under for the 3rd time while a dozen people on the shore stood frozen. I had been a lifeguard in college a decade before that, and my body moved before my mind caught up. I got him to shore. The ambulance took him away before I ever learned his name. "Yes," I said slowly. "That was me." "My name is Nathaniel Cole," he said. "Nate! And for 6 years, I've been trying to find the woman who pulled me out of that lake." Before I could answer, Preston, the loan officer, who had followed me partway toward the door with my declined paperwork still in his hand, hesitated near the counter, unsure whether to interrupt. Nate glanced past me at him, then back at the teller station behind the glass partition, where an older woman named Ms. Okonkwo, the branch manager, was watching the exchange with visible curiosity. "Actually," Nate said, raising his voice just slightly, loud enough to carry to the counter, "before you close her file, would you mind checking her other account?" Ms. Okonkwo blinked. "I'm sorry, sir, her other account?" "The trust account," Nate said calmly, "under Rachel Doyle. It should be linked to this branch's routing network. I set it up 6 years ago." I stood there frozen, certain there had been some mistake, some confusion of names. I had no trust account. I had never had more than $11,000 in my life at any single point in time. But Miss Okonkwo typed something into her terminal, frowned, typed again, and then her face changed in a way I will remember for the rest of my life, the particular expression of someone looking at a number they assume must be a system error. "There is an account," she said slowly, looking up at me and then at Nate. "Opened 6 years ago. Held in trust, converting to full individual ownership on the account holder's 44th birthday. She looked back down at her screen. "Miss Doyle, did you turn 44 this year?" My birthday had been 3 weeks earlier. I had spent it eating a frozen dinner alone at my kitchen table because I could not afford to go out. "The current balance," Ms. Okonkwo said, her voice noticeably unsteady now, "is $6,240,000. I did not faint, though for a moment the floor of that bank felt like it had tilted on some invisible axis. Preston, still holding my declined loan application, simply stood there with his mouth slightly open. I turned to Nate Cole, a man I had met exactly once, for less than 4 minutes, on the worst day of his life 6 years earlier, and I could not form a single word. "I never got your name at the lake," he said quietly. "It took me almost 2 years to even confirm which rescue call it was, and another 4 to track down who you were. I didn't want to just hand you money. I wanted to build something that would be there whenever you needed it, growing quietly in the background, so that whenever life caught up with you, it would already be waiting. I had no idea it would be today. I did not tell Nate Cole everything that morning. I was too disoriented, too raw, standing in the lobby of a bank that had just told me I wasn't creditworthy enough to borrow $500, learning in the same breath that I was worth more than $6 million. We exchanged phone numbers. He asked if he could take me to coffee later that week, properly, to explain what he'd built and why. I said yes without fully hearing myself say it. I drove home on autopilot to the small rented duplex on Kenilworth Road I had moved into 8 months earlier, after the mortgage on the house I'd lived in for 13 years became impossible to carry alone. It was clean and small, and felt like a waiting room rather than a home. I made a cup of coffee I never drank and sat down at my kitchen table with every financial document I owned spread out in front of me. That was the afternoon I stopped pretending I didn't understand what had happened to my business. I went through it line by line. Ridgeline Supply Partners, Blue Harbor Consulting, 2 more shell entities I now identified, Cobalt Logistics Group, and a 4th called Tanner Fixture Holdings, all of them billing Doyle and Rowe for materials and services that, as far as I could determine, had never actually been delivered. Over roughly 14 months, the total drain through these false vendors came to approximately $271,000. Our annual revenue had been close to $1.1 million, so the damage had been engineered slowly, carefully, the way you lower a room's temperature 1 degree at a time so that nothing inside it notices until it's already freezing. And then there were the ownership documents. 8 months earlier, Grant had presented what he called a restructuring agreement, converting our LLC into a new entity, Doyle and Rowe Holdings LLC. He'd explained it in calm, reasonable language, as protection for our personal assets. Nicole had been enthusiastic. I had signed it in the parking lot of Danny's rehabilitation facility, running on 4 hours of sleep, while Grant stood beside my car with a folder and a pen already uncapped. "Just initial the flag pages, Rachel. Same terms. This is just the legal wrapper." I trusted them. I signed. I found the actual restructuring agreement that night, tucked at the back of a folder I had almost not opened. Buried in Section 6, subsection D, was a clause that made my hands go cold. Upon conversion, ownership interests would be recalculated according to each partner's documented capital contribution over the preceding 20 months. Nicole's contribution was listed at $540,000. Mine was listed at $9,000. 17 years of my life, reduced on paper to $9,000 and a 1.6% ownership stake in the company I had built from a storage unit and a second-hand sewing machine. The delinquent credit accounts made sense now, too. They had been used, I would later learn, to finance equipment purchases for the business during a period when my signature had somehow been reproduced on the applications without my knowledge. I didn't yet understand exactly how Grant had accomplished that. I was beginning to understand, though, that Grant Ashford was not a man who left much to improvisation. I made a list that night, the way I always did when a problem felt too large to hold in my head all at once. On the left side of a legal pad I wrote everything I knew for certain. The shell companies, the dollar amounts, the dates, the forged capital figures in Section 6, subsection D. On the right side I wrote everything I didn't yet understand. How Grant had actually gotten my signature onto credit applications I'd never seen. Whether Nicole had known from the very beginning or only come to know gradually. In pieces, the way you sometimes talk yourself into believing something convenient rather than something true. I didn't have answers for the right-hand column yet, but writing the questions down, in my own handwriting, in my own kitchen, felt like the first real thing I had done for myself in months that wasn't reactive. It felt like taking the wheel back. I sat at that table long after the light outside my window had faded to nothing. I could hear a television through the shared wall, someone's dog barking 2 doors down. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday evening happening around a life that no longer felt ordinary at all. Was I afraid? Yes, in a way I hadn't been since the cold shock of Silver Creek Lake closing over my head 6 years earlier. But here is what I remembered about that day at the lake. The fear hadn't stopped me. It had sharpened me. It had made me faster, more precise, more certain of exactly what needed to happen next. I thought about Danny that night, too, about the last conversation we'd had in that rehabilitation facility 3 days before he passed, when he'd squeezed my hand with what strength he had left and told me, "You built something real, Ratch. Don't let anybody talk you out of what's actually yours." I hadn't understood in the moment how literally I would need to hold on to those words. I understood it now, sitting at that kitchen table with shell company invoices spread out like a losing hand of cards. I was 44 years old. I had built one company from nothing. I had trusted the wrong 2 people with it, and it had nearly cost me everything I owned. But I was not broken. I was angry, a clean, organized kind of anger that felt less like panic and more like a plan waiting to be written down. I opened my laptop and searched. Business fraud attorney, Asheville, North Carolina, forensic accounting. I wrote down 3 names. By 11 that night I had sent a message to a woman named Vanessa Pierce, a civil litigation attorney who had spent 9 years as an investigator with the Securities and Exchange Commission before entering private practice. Her profile photo showed a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back, wire-rimmed glasses, and the unhurried gaze of someone who had already seen the worst version of most stories and was rarely surprised by a new one. I hit send, and for the first time in months, I slept through the entire night without waking at 3 in the morning. Vanessa Pierce called at 8:40 the next morning. She did not waste time on pleasantries, which I appreciated immediately. "Your message was thorough and well organized," she said. "That's going to save us both a great deal of time. Can you come in this afternoon?" Her office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted mill building on the French Broad River, 11 blocks from the bank branch where I had been turned down the day before. I sat in a small waiting room that smelled like coffee and old paper and thought about how strange it was that an entire life could pivot on the events of one single week. Vanessa listened the way trained investigators listen, hands still, eyes fixed on my face, interrupting only to ask precise, narrowing questions. When I finished laying out my folders on her conference table, she was quiet for a long moment. "The restructuring agreement," she said finally. "Do you still have the draft version, the one before Grant's final edits, and any email correspondence from him in the weeks before you signed?" "I have some emails. I'm not sure how useful they are. Forward everything to my paralegal tonight. Don't delete anything, and don't contact either of them about any of this." She looked at me over her glasses. "Are you currently in contact with Nicole? She texted me last week asking how I'm holding up. I never answered." "Good. Keep it that way." She explained that what I was describing carried multiple potential dimensions: fraudulent conveyance, wire fraud through the false invoicing scheme, likely identity theft connected to the unauthorized credit applications. Civil liability, she said, was almost certain. Criminal exposure was possible, depending on what the documents ultimately showed. Her retainer was $6,000, which at that point I genuinely did not have. I told her so plainly. She studied me for a moment and said she had taken cases on contingency before, when she believed in them, and that she'd give me an answer by Friday. On Friday she called and agreed to take the case on contingency at 30% of any recovery. I agreed without hesitation. That same Friday evening, I drove out to the storage unit I still kept behind the old fabric warehouse, the very first one, the one where Doyle and Rowe had technically been born 11 years earlier. I hadn't been back in years. I unlocked the rusted latch and stood in the doorway looking at the folding table I'd started with, still there under a stiff canvas tarp, the second-hand sewing machine beside it gathering dust. I don't know exactly why I needed to see it that night. Maybe I needed proof, physical and undeniable, that what Nicole and Grant were trying to erase had actually existed, had actually been built by two tired, broke 22-year-olds who believed effort meant something. I sat on an overturned crate for 20 minutes, and then I locked the door again and drove home feeling steadier than I had in weeks. What happened next, I did not see coming. Nicole called me that Monday morning, not a text, an actual phone call, something she hadn't initiated in months. Her voice carried its familiar warmth, but underneath it now I could hear a tightness I recognized only because I was finally listening for it. Rach, hi. I've been thinking about you so much. I know things have been so hard since Danny. I feel awful we haven't really talked. Could you come by the studio this week? There are a few things I'd like to go over. Things she wanted to go over, after months of near silence, after I had twice requested copies of the restructuring documents and been told they were with Grant's office. What had shifted? Had someone mentioned seeing me walk into a law office downtown? Had Grant noticed a records request routed through our registered agent? Or was it simply the old animal instinct of someone who has done something wrong, sensing, faintly, that consequences were approaching from somewhere just out of sight? I'll check my schedule, I said pleasantly and ended the call. I forwarded a summary to Vanessa within the hour, along with my suspicion that they were starting to watch me. Her reply came back fast. Expected. Do nothing to alarm them. Behave normally. We're closer than you think. What we were closer to arrived 4 days later. Vanessa's paralegal, a relentless young man named Owen who apparently never slept, had been running a forensic comparison of every signature page I'd provided against the metadata embedded in the underlying digital files. He found something. The power of attorney document I had signed in the parking lot at Danny's rehabilitation facility, the same document Grant had used as legal justification for acting on my behalf during the restructuring, had been altered. Not the signature itself, but the file's edit history. The metadata showed the document had been modified 9 months after I originally signed it. A clause had been quietly added, broadening the scope of authorized representation from routine administrative matters to full authority to execute binding ownership transfers. That clause simply had not existed on the day I signed the page. I sat in Vanessa's conference room and read the forensic report twice. My hands were steady. My voice, when I finally spoke, was steady too. This is forgery. Document fraud, Vanessa confirmed, setting down her pen. Which is a federal offense, and combined with a wire fraud running through those shell company invoices, Rachel, this stopped being simple civil litigation about 20 minutes ago. She was right, and somewhere across Asheville, Nicole and Grant Ashford had no idea the ground beneath them had already shifted. The plan we built over the following weeks was not dramatic. It was procedural, methodical, and deliberately quiet. We filed a civil complaint in Buncombe County Superior Court alleging fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraudulent conveyance of business assets. At the same time, Vanessa submitted a formal referral to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Charlotte, including the forensic analysis of the altered power of attorney, the documented shell company invoicing pattern, and evidence connected to the unauthorized credit applications carrying my forged signature. We filed. We documented. We waited. By this point, I had also had 2 long conversations over coffee with Nate Cole. He told me, without any theatrical flourish, that on the afternoon I pulled him from Silver Creek Lake, he had been in the worst stretch of his professional life. His first company, an early scheduling platform for rural medical clinics, had just collapsed, taking almost everything he'd saved with it. He had gone to the lake alone that day to think, he said, and he didn't elaborate much further than that. He didn't need to. I understood what he meant. 18 months after the lake, his second company, a health technology platform called Pulsewell, became one of the fastest-growing companies in the Southeast, and by the time we sat across from each other in that coffee shop, Nate Cole was worth somewhere north of $380 million. He lived modestly for a man of his means, kept a small house outside Charlotte, and had spent 6 years quietly trying to locate the woman who had waded into cold water without a second thought. "I want you to understand something," he told me during our second conversation. "What I built for you wasn't charity. You made a decision that cost you a few minutes of fear and effort, and it gave me every year I've had since. This is arithmetic, not generosity." 3 weeks after we filed the complaint, Grant showed up outside my duplex. I came home from the grocery store on a Wednesday evening and found him standing near my front steps in his work clothes. No tie, his expression arranged into the careful, faintly wounded reasonableness I now recognized as his default setting. "Rachel, can we talk? Nicole is devastated. She thinks there's been some terrible misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Grant," I said, not moving toward my door. "You filed a complaint that could destroy everything Nicole spent her whole adult life building," he said. And beneath the calm now was something harder, something that had clearly been there the entire time and had simply stopped bothering to hide. "That business is your legacy, too. Do you actually want to hand it to lawyers and federal investigators? Litigation like this destroys companies, Rachel. You'll get nothing. Nicole gets nothing. 14 employees lose their jobs. Is that really what you want?" I looked at him for a long moment. "What I want is a 50% ownership that was fraudulently taken from me. I want the $271,000 that was funneled through shell companies into accounts you control. I want the credit accounts opened in my name closed and cleared. I want those things because they are legally and factually mine." Something flickered across his face, brief, quickly smoothed over, but I saw it. The recognition that I wasn't guessing anymore. I had numbers. I had documents. "You are making a very serious mistake," he said quietly. "I made one serious mistake in my life, Grant. I trusted you." He left. I stood on my own front steps for a while after his car pulled away, then went inside, set down my groceries, and called Vanessa. "He came by the house," I said. "Did he make any explicit threats?" she asked, her voice sharpening instantly. "Implicit ones. The employees suffering. The business being destroyed. Me walking away with nothing. That's witness intimidation of a plaintiff. Write down the time, the location, exactly what he said, word for word. We're adding it to the file." The offer arrived by email 11 days later, sent directly to my personal address instead of through Vanessa's office. Itself a small strategic choice, a way of reaching me without a legal intermediary standing between us, a way of making it feel personal rather than formal and recorded. "Nicole, I know things have gotten so complicated, and I take real responsibility for some of that. Grant and I have talked, and we want to make this right. We're prepared to offer you a buyout of $135,000 for your remaining interest in Doyle and Rowe, and we'll work with the bank to have the disputed credit accounts transferred to a different responsible party. This is a fair number, given the current restructure valuation. I hope you'll really consider it. I miss you. I miss us. Please, let's not let lawyers finish destroying what we spent 17 years building." I read it twice. $135,000, offered in exchange for walking away from a claim covering $271,000 in fraudulently diverted funds, plus the restoration of a 50% stake in a business generating over $1 million a year, plus my silence. I forwarded it to Vanessa without comment. She called within 20 minutes. "Do not respond to this," she said. "This email is evidence of consciousness of guilt. They would not be offering you anything if they weren't frightened of what we already have. And the number itself tells us exactly how little they think you understand your own claim to be worth." I didn't respond, but the offer stayed lodged in my mind, not as temptation, but as information. 6 months earlier, $135,000 would have felt enormous. It would have solved every unsolvable thing in my life at that moment. Now it felt like exactly what it was, a small, frightened number, offered by two people hoping I was still desperate enough to take it. I was not desperate anymore. That was the real difference. Part of it was the legal momentum, knowing Vanessa's evidence was solid, that the federal referral had been formally acknowledged, that something real was being constructed brick by brick. But part of it, honestly, was the people who had quietly assembled themselves around me during those weeks, without ceremony, the way real support tends to arrive. My neighbor, Dot Whitmore, a retired ICU nurse who lived 2 doors down, showed up one Sunday with a pot of chicken and rice and the blunt observation that I looked like I'd lost 8 pounds I couldn't afford to lose. She sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours, and I told her more than I'd planned to. She was 68, had buried a husband and survived a cancer scare of her own, and she listened with the patient, unpitying attention of someone who understood that some seasons of life are simply cold, and that surviving them is its own form of accomplishment. "You're going to be all right," she told me before she left. Not a question, a statement, delivered with the same certainty she'd probably once used on 100 frightened patients who needed someone to believe in them before they could believe in themselves. My cousin Marisol in Charlotte called every Sunday evening. She wasn't a lawyer, but she'd worked as a paralegal for years, and she was furious on my behalf in the most useful way possible, practically, analytically, helping me organize documents rather than simply validating my anger, which I needed far more than sympathy at that point. Even Preston, the young loan officer who had declined my application that first Tuesday morning, sent me a message through the bank's customer portal a few weeks later. It was brief and a little awkward, the kind of message someone drafts and redrafts before finally hitting send. "I hope things are going okay for you, Miss Doyle. That morning has stuck with me more than I expected." I wrote back and told him he had nothing to apologize for. He'd only ever been doing his job honestly, following the numbers in front of him, and there was something almost comforting in that. Not everyone in my life during those months was pretending to be something they weren't. Some people were exactly who they appeared to be, and that turned out to matter more than I'd ever given it credit for. And then there was what Nate did on the last Thursday in October. He called that evening, and his voice had the careful, deliberate quality of someone who had spent real time deciding exactly what to say. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said. "The trust account at the bank, I built that as a floor, so you'd never fall completely through. But I also want to make sure this case doesn't drag on for years, because you're running out of runway to fight it properly. I've already transferred additional funds directly, so the trust conversion isn't tied up in any bank processing delays. Check your account tomorrow morning." I told him it was too much, that I hadn't earned it, that it made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't fully articulate. He was quiet for a moment. "Rachel, you didn't hesitate for 1 second at that lake. I've had 6 years to think about what that kind of decision is worth. Please just let me finish what I started." The next morning I opened my banking app out of the same low-grade anxious habit I developed over the last several months and stopped breathing for a second. A notification had come through at 6:55 a.m. Trust conversion complete. Additional deposit received. Total balance, $6,240,000. I sat down on my kitchen floor, not because I felt faint exactly, but because the floor happened to be wherever my legs decided to stop cooperating. I sat there for several minutes with the phone in my hand and the early light coming through the window, thinking about a Tuesday morning 11 days earlier when a 26-year-old loan officer had told me I couldn't be trusted with $500. Then I got up, made coffee, and called Vanessa. My financial situation has changed, I told her. I'd like to bring in additional forensic accountants, and I'd like to move as fast as the process allows. They arrived together this time, which told me something on its own, that they decided a coordinated appearance carried more weight than Grant's earlier solo visit. It was a Saturday morning in early November, and I'd just come back from a run when I noticed Nicole's white SUV parked outside my duplex. They were waiting by my front steps. Nicole was dressed carefully, soft cream coat, understated jewelry, the entire assembled image of a reasonable woman making a reasonable gesture. Grant stood half a step behind her, hands in his jacket pockets, wearing the neutral expression of a man who has decided the most dangerous thing he could do right now is appear rattled. "Rachel!" Nicole stepped forward, her voice hitting the exact frequency she used when she was performing warmth rather than feeling it. "I'm so glad we caught you. Can we come in? Just 5 minutes. We can talk right here," I said. A flicker crossed Nicole's eyes, quickly adjusted. "Of course. I've just been thinking so much, and I feel terrible. There were decisions during the restructuring I should have pushed back on, and I didn't. I'm sorry, Rachel. I really am." Her hand drifted toward my arm, and then stopped, reading something in my posture. "I think we can still fix this between the two of us, without all of," she gestured vaguely, meaning the lawyers, the filing, the forensic accountants now assembled against her. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. Grant spoke for the first time. "We're prepared to offer a full partnership buyout at an independently appraised fair market value, roughly $195,000, in exchange for a complete release of all claims. Given the cost and uncertainty of prolonged litigation, this is realistically the best outcome available to you. Even if you eventually won, you'd spend years getting there, and the business would be worth a fraction of what it is today." There it was, the real message underneath the soft code and the rehearsed apology. "Take what we're offering now, while there's still something left to take, because we can make sure there won't be." "Nicole," I said, "when I was driving to Hickory every weekend to sit with my dying brother, and Grant put those restructuring papers in front of me with the pen already uncapped and told me it was just a formality, were you in the room?" A pause. The street around us was quiet except for someone's sprinkler running 2 houses down. "That's not fair," Nicole said, and her voice dropped a full degree, all the warmth gone from it now. "We were trying to protect the business. Protect both of us. By altering a document I'd already signed," I said, keeping my voice level, my anger sitting so far beneath the surface now that it had become something closer to structural, part of what was actually holding me upright. "By creating companies that existed only to bill us for services no one ever provided. By opening credit accounts in my name without my knowledge. The FBI is already aware of all of this, Nicole. So is the U.S. Attorney's Office. This is not a conversation between former business partners anymore. It's a federal investigation." The color drained out of Nicole's face. Grant's careful composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see underneath it. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," he said, and the practiced reasonableness was gone entirely now, his voice flat and finally, fully honest. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. We have relationships in this city that go back 20 years. You'll spend everything you have on lawyers and walk away with nothing, and you will have burned every bridge that could ever help you rebuild anything. I'm telling you this because I know exactly how these things go." He meant it as a threat. What he didn't know was that it landed on me as information. He was afraid. People who aren't afraid don't threaten strangers on a sidewalk. "Thank you for coming by," I said, and turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind me before either of them could say another word. The federal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in December at the federal courthouse on Patton Avenue. It wasn't yet a criminal trial. That process, Vanessa explained, would take considerably longer. This was a combined civil hearing on our complaint alongside a preliminary evidentiary presentation requested by the U.S. Attorney's Office, which had formally opened a criminal investigation into the document fraud and wire fraud allegations. The two proceedings had been coordinated at the court's discretion, which Vanessa said was unusual, and which likely meant investigators had built their case faster than either Grant or Nicole had anticipated. Grant had hired a partner from one of the most expensive firms in Charlotte. I had expected that. I had also expected him to walk into that courtroom with the particular confidence of a man who had spent his career in side rooms exactly like it, who understood their rhythms and their shortcuts. What he had not expected was the full scope of what Vanessa and federal investigators had quietly assembled over the preceding months. I sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer I'd bought secondhand 3 weeks earlier and pressed with more care than I'd given any garment in years. Vanessa sat beside me, a legal pad in front of her, her posture carrying the stillness I'd come to recognize as her working mode. Economical, focused, quietly relentless. Across the room, Nicole sat behind her husband's defense table in an ivory blouse, hands folded in her lap, not looking at me once as she entered. Grant did look at me, a long, measuring stare meant to communicate certainty, and then turned forward. The government's attorney, a compact, methodical woman named Renata Solis, presented the forensic evidence first. Exhibit 1. The original power of attorney as it existed on the day I signed it in that rehabilitation facility parking lot. Exhibit 2. The same document as it existed in Grant's files, with the added clause authorizing him to execute binding ownership transfers on my behalf. A digital forensics analyst, Dr. Priya Anand, testified that the file had been altered 9 months after the original signing, a fact embedded in the document's edit metadata and independently confirmed through server logs recovered from Grant's law firm's cloud backup system. Grant's attorney objected. The objection was overruled. Exhibit 3. Banking records tracing $271,400 transferred from Doyle and Rose's operating account into the 4 shell companies over 14 months. Exhibit 4. Incorporation records showing all 4 shell entities registered to a trust administered by Grant, filed through an intermediary name that federal investigators had traced back to him through a notarized document bearing his own signature. Exhibit 5, and this was the one that finally broke Grant's composure across the room, was a set of emails recovered from his firm's server backup, exchanged with a business associate named Corey Falk over roughly 19 months. In language so direct and so unguarded that its authors had clearly never imagined it would be read by anyone beyond themselves. She signed everything at the rehab facility without even looking. Easiest close of my career, one email read. The courtroom went very quiet. I watched Grant read his own words projected on a screen in a federal courtroom, watched the exact moment his face stopped performing calm and started performing arithmetic, calculating something with no visible solution. Nicole made a small sound from behind him. Not quite a word, not quite a sob, something caught and swallowed halfway. When it was her turn, Vanessa was surgical. She laid out the civil damages, the fraudulently reallocated ownership stake, the diverted funds, the unauthorized credit accounts totaling $36,900 opened without my consent, the collapse of my credit, the loss of my income, 2 years of quiet financial sabotage that had ultimately reduced me to applying for a $500 emergency loan at a bank that turned me away. She did not embellish. She didn't need to. Grant's attorney attempted a counter-narrative that the restructuring had been undertaken in good faith, that the shell companies served legitimate consulting functions, that the emails were being read out of context. His voice was steady and his argument was carefully constructed, and it landed in that courtroom like something dropped from a great height into still water, briefly visible, then gone without a trace. The presiding judge, a soft-spoken man named Harlan Feld who had served on the federal bench for over 2 decades, listened with his hands folded, his gaze moving steadily between the screens and the faces in front of him. When the presentations concluded, he didn't rule on the civil matter immediately. That would come in writing within 30 days, but he did speak. "The court notes," he said, "that the evidence presented today includes documentary proof of deliberate and sustained fraud against the plaintiff, and that this evidence has been formally transmitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office for criminal proceedings. The court further notes that altering a notarized legal instrument after execution constitutes a serious felony under both federal and state law." He looked at Grant with the expression of a man who had seen many things and remained unsurprised by this one, though no less serious for it. "The plaintiff has more than met her evidentiary burden for purposes of this hearing." I did not cry. I had half expected to, some release after months of held tension. What I felt instead was quieter, the particular satisfaction of something being set right after being wrong for a long time. I turned and looked at Nicole one last time as the hearing adjourned. She was staring down at her folded hands and did not look up. The civil judgment arrived 24 days later. Judge Felt found in my favor on every count. The court ordered restoration of my 50% ownership stake in Doyle and Rowe Holdings, LLC. It ordered disgorgement of a $271,400 in fraudulently diverted funds, plus interest and legal costs. It ordered the closure and full settlement of every unauthorized credit account opened in my name, with all associated debt transferred to the defendants. It awarded punitive damages of $210,000, reflecting the court's finding that the fraud had been deliberate, sustained, and carried out with conscious disregard for my welfare. Total civil judgment, $514,700, plus restored equity. Vanessa called when the ruling came through and read the key findings aloud in her careful, measured voice. When she finished, there was a brief pause. "Rachel," she said, "we won completely." I was standing at my kitchen window when she called, looking out at the same narrow strip of parking lot I'd stared at through months of fear and 3 a.m. sleeplessness. It looked exactly the same. Asphalt, a security light, someone else's car, and somehow it looked entirely different. "We did," I said. The criminal proceedings moved forward on their own timeline. Grant was indicted by a federal grand jury on 5 counts. 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of mail fraud, 1 count of falsifying a legal document, and 1 count of identity theft connected to the unauthorized credit applications. Corey Falk, his associate, was indicted alongside him on 3 related counts. Grant's firm placed him on administrative leave within 48 hours of the indictment. 3 weeks later, the North Carolina State Bar opened a disciplinary proceeding and suspended his license pending the outcome of the criminal case. Nicole was not criminally indicted. The threshold for conspiracy required proof that she had known specifically about the document alteration, and the evidence available did not clear that bar. But the civil judgment named her as a co-defendant, making her jointly liable for the full financial damages. Since neither of us could continue as business partners, we agreed, through our attorneys and never directly, to an independent valuation and sale of the business. Doyle and Rowe was appraised at $1.9 million. We split the proceeds equally after the judgment amounts were satisfied, roughly $960,000 each. $960,000. I sat with that number for a long time, not because money solves everything, but because of what it represented. The documented, legally binding confirmation that what had happened to me was real, was wrong, and had consequences that could not simply be argued away by a man in an expensive suit. At Grant's federal criminal trial, which concluded the following spring, he was convicted on 4 of the 5 counts and sentenced to 38 months in federal prison, along with $187,000 in court-ordered restitution. Corey Falk pleaded guilty before trial and received 24 months. I was not present for the sentencing. I had already stood witness to the part that was mine to stand witness to. The sentencing itself was simply the law doing what the law does, without requiring my presence. Vanessa called me from the courthouse parking lot afterward. 38 months, plus restitution, she said. Good, I answered, not with satisfaction at Grant's suffering exactly, but with the grounded recognition that the world had correctly identified something wrong and applied a response that matched it. That is what the law exists for. That is what the truth is for. I had been a woman who walked into a bank for $500 and walked out with nothing but a declined application. I had fought carefully, patiently, refusing to stop until I had the entire picture assembled in front of me. And the full picture, it turned out, was more than enough. The following spring, I moved into a 2-story bungalow on Kimberly Avenue, an older neighborhood, tall oaks, a wide front porch, a kitchen large enough to actually cook and properly. I signed the lease with the strange lightness of someone finally returning to a version of herself she'd been afraid she had lost for good. Nate helped me move. He drove up from outside Charlotte instead of flying, and we carried boxes up the porch steps under early April sunshine on an afternoon that was entirely ordinary and also, somehow, one of the best I'd had in years. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a life after a storm like that finally passes. Not silence exactly, but a lowering of volume, as if someone had finally found the dial and turned it down to something livable. I noticed it first in small ways. I slept through entire nights again, all the way through, without the 3 a.m. jolt of remembering something was wrong before I could remember what. I stopped flinching every time my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I started cooking real meals again, instead of standing over the sink eating cereal out of the box, because eventually a home only feels like a home again once you start treating yourself like someone worth feeding properly. By that summer, I had registered a new company, Marrow Interiors, for employees, a shared studio space, a client base built entirely on my own name and my own reputation this time. A wedding industry planner who had referred us clients for years wrote me a note that said simply, "Always preferred working with you over Nicole, honestly. Welcome back." Marrow turned its first profit in month 6. I hired a bookkeeper with zero tolerance for irregularities of any kind, and I have not signed a single document since without reading every word of it twice. Nicole moved to Savannah and attempted to reinvent herself as a design consultant. Federal court records are public, and her new practice folded within 7 months. Grant served 31 months, emerged with a permanently revoked law license and a felony record, and now lives in a small apartment outside Winston-Salem. I saw Nicole exactly once more, purely by accident, at a fabric trade show in Atlanta almost 2 years after the judgment. She was standing near a booth of discounted remnants, looking smaller than I remembered, older around the eyes. We made brief, unavoidable eye contact across the aisle. She didn't approach me, and I didn't approach her. There was nothing left to say that a courtroom hadn't already said more precisely than either of us could manage in a convention hall. I simply nodded once, the way you might acknowledge a stranger, and kept walking toward the booth I'd actually come to see. That still brings soup twice a month, whether I need it or not, and I have long since stopped pretending I don't look forward to it. Marisol flew up for Marrow's first anniversary party and cried harder than I did when I cut the ribbon on the new studio door. And Nate still calls, not about the money, never really about the money at all, just to ask how the work is going, whether I'm sleeping, whether Asheville got the rain it needed this week. Some debts, honestly, I've come to understand, were never meant to be repaid in a single transaction. Some of them you simply carry forward, gently, and pass along to somebody else when your own turn arrives to be the stranger who stops on a sidewalk and says the thing that changes everything. People ask me sometimes, usually gently, whether I regret the years I spent trusting Nicole before any of this happened, whether, knowing how it ended, I would go back and build something smaller, something safer, something less exposed to the people closest to me. I always tell them no. Trust was never the mistake. The mistake was refusing to look closely at the moment trust started asking me to stop paying attention. I know the difference now, and I carry that knowledge into every contract, every partnership, every handshake I make going forward, without letting it curdle into permanent suspicion of everyone around me. That balance, I think, is the real inheritance this whole ordeal left me with. What does it actually feel like to have your life handed back to you? It isn't cinematic. It isn't triumphant, not in the way movies make it look. It feels like walking back into a room you've been locked out of for a long time. Familiar, a little dusty in the corners, but unmistakably, undeniably your own. If this story moved you, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single comment. And if you want to hear what happens when the people who wronged you finally run out of places to hide, stay close. There's another story waiting for you right here on Kate's Fortune Stories.